for higher education and research. So now we want to go to the audience for questions, but to get some help up here from people who actually know the answers, I'd like to call some of our organizers up to sit on the stage, please. So that would be Anna Marie Kelsey, Mary Woolley, Lori Leshin, and I'd like to ask Rick Miller also to join us. Rick is chair of the Board of Higher Education and Workforce. And then as soon as we get everybody up here, I'll ask you to come to the mics and pose your questions. And if they're long, then we'll stay here a long time. If they're short and to the point, and I think we could entertain a brief comment. Usually I say everything has to end in a question mark, but I would say 2 statements at most. First one can be a short comment, if you wish. Second one can be a short question. I think 1 question each probably would do it. So we almost have everybody up here, but I think if one of you could go to the mics so that I don't stand up here looking like a fool, or just stand up here looking like a fool, we would take the first question. Questions can be anything on any related topic. If we run out of related topics, we'll move on to other things. Thank you. First question.
Hi, Nick Ponzio from Rutgers University in New Jersey. This conference is great. I came here for the next conference, which is tomorrow, but the topic dovetailed very nicely. Tomorrow is the science of science communication. And we've heard a lot about communication this afternoon, which really warms my heart. I've stopped doing basic research science to help our PhD and master's students learn how to communicate what they do in ways that people can understand to people beyond their field. And although I've heard a lot about interest in the topic, I haven't heard a lot about how we're going to do it. So if you can maybe give me some guidance, I would appreciate it very much.
Thank you. How are we going to do it?
I'll start out on that. I mentioned in my remarks about what I think is a time for change and the institution of a course that covers communication to non-scientists, although it would also be useful to cover skills in communicating to one's peers. But to have a course that includes that and other aspects that will always be part of science students or engineering students' forward-going career and life skills we're talking about, that include communication and understanding how the political system that provides the boundary conditions, the framework, the kinds of things that Chairwoman just talked about for science and always will, and engaging with the public. Now, I said in that, when I made my comment, that it should be a, quote, required course. And I said that because I've been hearing more and more from students in particular, but also from faculty in the sciences around the country, that they realize the need for that kind of learning at the graduate science level. But it just isn't going to happen until there is real ownership by department chairs, deans, provosts, university presidents, saying this is something that we value and we're going to teach you how to do. And we recognize that it's part of being accountable to the taxpayer, and it's part of saying and conveying to the public, I work for you, we work for you, that's why we're here. And that kind of conversation and learning how to have it is how we're going to, I believe, change hearts and minds for science in an ongoing way, and so that we're not looking at the kind of statistics that the chairwoman gave us about the public's sinking appreciation for the value of a college education.
I can talk about some specifics that we're doing that seem to be working relatively well, and I found that a lot of things at our university, you start off with a smaller group of people, you incentivize them to do something, they find it rewarding, and particularly with faculty, I think with students, requirements sometimes work better, but we have a dinner series, and these are all wealthy people in the area who are affiliated with the university. Not all of them, less than half of them are actually our alums, who sign up to basically host a dinner that a faculty member will speak at. It's at their home, and they invite, anywhere from, 15 to 30 friends, depending on what it is. It's competitive who gets invited. They have to put together a title and a brief discussion, and people pick what they want at their home. And it really has been incredibly successful because these are smart people, but they're not academics. And so you are signing up to do something for the public, and then we do have a group of our communications and individuals, et cetera, who work with them on putting together the presentation. Now, for them it's exciting because chances are that maybe someone will end up donating to their research program, et cetera. So that's the incentive, is that they're going to get their ideas out there, and they know that they need to be communicating, that they can't do their PowerPoints because it's in a living room, and they've got to talk at a level that someone that is not a non. So we've got that program that we have going. We also have, and this has been a real program that's been championed by, like I say, our Dean of the College of the Environment, and she actually has some trainings that you can sign up to do in that area, and it's been fabulous. I mean, yesterday I was doing, I come a couple times a year to talk to our congressional delegation and our Senate delegation, and I heard two different people who told me of her faculty member who they had talked to and what a good job they did in helping them communicate something. So again, this is small. It's a minority of our faculty. We try and make sure that we don't just have senior faculty, but we have junior faculty involved. But every year it's been widening. And it's a small program, but I think that it's a start. I think we need to do more than that, but just trying to share a small success.
And I guess I would say I feel like at some level, yes, we need to help everyone involved in science and discovery and engineering research be better at conveying the value to society, even if it's not applied research, of their endeavors. And I think that communication is important. But I think that even like this whole we need to tell a better story thing, I just have the sense that that's not going to be the thing that solves the problem. It's necessary but not sufficient. So we've got to be better communicators. But guess what? You got to meet people where they are. They don't want to be talked to. They want to be engaged. They want to be part of solutions. And so how do we start to think really differently about engagement, not necessarily just communication? And again, I would argue that teaching is a relatively low risk way to get more faculty involved in deeper engagement in communities. And we know that it is an extraordinary benefit to students to have that experience in, again, the real world communities. We have a ton of data that shows that, that 89% of our students who are involved in project-based learning would say that the number one thing it did for them was it made them take responsibility for their own learning. If there was a single learning outcome we could hope our students would have, it would be that they realize that they've got to keep learning for their whole lives, and this way of engaging with communities, which is great for communities, also really helps our students. So I would say it's communication and engagement is really what we've got to be thinking about as we want to try and cross those, what are getting to be pretty big divides between our communities and even sometimes the communities we grow up and live in, but certainly with communities around the world. There's a lot more challenges to overcome there. I bet Luke has something to say about that.
I'd like to endorse everything that's been said and add a little concern that that may not be enough. This is a problem that we've had for many, many years. When I was a graduate student, I was told that when things are very difficult and seem to be resistant to the methods that we've used, you should really base your work on the assumptions involved. There's something wrong with what we're assuming, and there's a couple of things that are sort of fundamental to what we believe in higher ed that I think are worthy of some time and energy in rethinking. So for example, before I got involved in doing what I'm doing now, which is leading this experimental place, Olin College, I was involved in leadership roles in Pac-10 and Big Ten research universities for a long time, so sort of deeply immersed in this culture. When I became a dean at the University of Iowa, I had this sort of rare responsibility of going off campus and talking to people in industry, which as a faculty member never really happened. I learned something really interesting. So I was talking to corporate partners of ours about the value to them of partnering with the university. And I got this idea from them that's quite different from what I heard from our own faculty, because our own faculty believed that what they really do is produce ideas. In fact, we go to great lengths to track our ideas as if they were our children. If you look at our resumes, we have pages and pages of things that I thought about in the shower one day, so I wrote this really brief article, and now I'm going to track it forever and see if anybody ever referenced it. I'm going to count those, I'm going to put them into the promotion committee. And we ask them, well, did you also have some students along the way? Oh yeah, like on the last page of my resume is the list of my PhD students. Well, where are they now? Well, the last time I talked to John was 4 years ago and he was doing X. Have no idea what's happening to the students. So if you were to think about this in terms of comparing what the faculty believe is important and where they add value in society, is they produce ideas. Oh yeah, and every once in a while some people. On the other hand, when you talk to the folks in industry, you get the opposite. Now they tell you, well, the value to us, of our corporation, of interacting with your university is the people you produce. We have this long list of alumni from your institution that have been really influential in our school, in our company. And every once in a while, there's an idea that they come that's actually useful for what we're trying to do. So there's sort of mismatch. Another illustration of this. A couple weeks ago, I was at an event that a company in the Bay Area, this forward thinking, I won't name them, involved, and it had the title of this workshop, The Future of Work. Okay, so they had maybe 15 people there, a few from universities, a few leaders in different corporations from around the country, and we spent 2 days thinking hard about what artificial intelligence, what robotics, what all of these different changes might mean to the lives of people in America so that they could think hard about what kind of products they should produce. And it struck me that in all my years in higher ed, I can't remember a time when a faculty meeting ended with a vote that we should invite a bunch of people from industry here to talk to us about what they see as the future of work so that we could design an education that would work for them. So I think this sort of comes from the basic root belief, at least that I was trained, and I first earned tenure at the University of California, which I think is a very fine institution. But the idea here is, where does innovation come from? Innovation comes from big science ideas, what I would call just-in-case science. That's why we get big grants from the National Science Foundation. And every once in a while, one of those ideas has probably something practical that you could do with it. So we'll throw that over the wall to the tech transfer office, and those guys will have lawyers, and they'll figure out how to start a company. And once in a while, those companies will actually grow roots and generate revenue back to the government so they can send us more grants. And that's pretty much it, okay? In other words, why would I need to talk to people in industry? It all comes from us around the table in this faculty meeting. That's an assumption that I never questioned for 25 years. Now I really think it's quite different. In fact, I believe that even why we educate people, as important as research is, it's really not complete. Research is fundamentally about finding things out. Finding things out is really cool, okay? But when we worship that to the exclusion of other things, I think we are in deep trouble. So besides finding things out, there's making sense out of the world. So maybe not really generating completely new ideas, but taking ideas that are out there and putting them in context and finding a big picture that makes sense. And that's not the only thing. besides finding things out, you also need to envision what has never been and do whatever it takes to make it happen. The sort of agency role that education produces. I really worry today that the next generation might not regret that we didn't have more people who were trained in research. We might worry that we didn't have more people who spent time worrying about what we should do as opposed to what we can do. And I'm not sure that that comes from the sciences. We really need to rethink, I think, what education is about. It's going to take some time. We didn't get here in a day. We won't get out of here in a day either.
If I could give a concrete example, because I think that this is important, because it isn't just about communication. We talk a lot about inclusive innovation. We're not the first people who have used that term, but the idea is, first, that it's not just people with PhDs that have good ideas.
Right.
And that, when you want to do something, you need to also talk to the community. It also, inclusive innovation also means that innovation shouldn't just be about making gadgets, but it should be about things like how do we solve homelessness. And the third part is that when we talk about disruption, we should also be thinking about who's being disrupted and how are we going to deal with that. So an example of something that we did that students had been wanting to do for years, and my predecessors thought it was a bad idea, and hey, I said, why not? And that is that our city decided, for good reasons, said that homelessness was a crisis. So we actually hosted a tent city. My understanding is we're the first non-religious affiliated university that's had a tent city on our campus, and we built a number of classes around it so that as we worked with the city on solutions, it wasn't coming from a lot of stereotypes about the homeless. About 3/4 of the people in the encampment worked every morning. In fact, one of the requirements for them, for us to be able to host them, was they needed to be near a bus line. And so all of a sudden, people's views, I had parents writing me, how can you do this? My kid's going to get this, that, or the other. And I've done a lot of research with homelessness, homeless youth in particular. And it was actually a wonderful experience. We actually have written up a program evaluation that the students did. The nursing students got experience with blisters on feet, and these folks got their feet taken care of. We had the dentist doing teeth. We had classes around. It was just really a fabulous experience that was very different, but that has that notion of we're going to build class. If we're going to be consulting with the city about what to do about the homelessness project, let's actually not just go out in the street and interview people, but let's bring them on. Let's do an immersement.
Get another question, one from this side.
Hi, Peter Henderson, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So on a cold, rainy Saturday back in the spring, there were about 30 or 40,000 people here on the mall for a March for Science. And the very next weekend, when the weather was much nicer, there was probably twice as many, maybe 100,000 people here for a climate march. In the second of those cases, it was not the first time there had been a climate march. There was a major climate march in New York City a year or 2 years ago. But in any event, that's a lot of people. There were sister marches all around the country. The Facebook page for the March for Science went from about 0 people liking it to 800,000 people liking it in a week. And one estimate is that about half of those people aren't even scientists. So when we're talking about support of research in science, engineering, and medicine, that seems like an important phenomenon. Now we know, what the context was in which those things happened. But I personally would like to think that that wasn't just a flash in the pan, just a one-off event. I was there for both of them. They were both very energizing events, among several other marches I've been to.
Question.
And so the question is, do you think it's a one-off event? Do you think that with all those hundreds of thousands of people excited about science, that there is something to be tapped there to support the scientific enterprise?
Thank you.
I can answer
Mary?
that. It wasn't a one-off event. It will be happening again next April, and hopefully in many, many, even more cities. I think it was more than 400 in this country and several sites around the world. And that's not the only thing that the March for Science is doing. They're also, along with a number of us, involved in a Get Out the Vote campaign to vote for science, or to at least think about science when you're voting. We actually have 12 election cycles behind us on working on embedding science, if you will, in the conversation that candidates for office have while they're running. Because the idea that somebody's going to become a champion for science when they didn't get elected on that issue, any aspect of science, nor even discussed it when they were running, is, you know, crazy thinking, frankly, to think suddenly you're going to get somebody who's going to become a champion. We have to build it in earlier. So the March is working on that. They're also working on public outreach, which is rightly identified as an additional necessary component to science communication. And they're going to have a convocation, if you will, on that next summer, I believe. So watch that space.
Did it make a difference?
I'm going to be an Eeyore about it. I think that Marches for Science are great. I think the context of that one was divisive. I think that if you look at the statistics, Democrats, you know, their support of science has stayed fairly constant, not as high as we'd like, but fairly constant in about the 60s. With Republicans over the last 2 years, it's gone like that. And, you know, Democrats will say that their main issue, this is higher education, not science, but their main issue with higher education is around affordability. And for Republicans, it's that it's politicized. That was a very politicized march. A lot of the key people in my university didn't participate. I didn't participate. I'm not saying people who did it loved it. It was great. But it was very much a bubble experience. I think that, you know, maybe sometimes we need to be with each other to be energized. If that's what it did, that's great. But I think it was very politicized. And in that sense, we were talking to the converted.
Other
I
observations?
just make sure that everybody heard that decline of Republican support for higher education is not about science.
No, but actually you see it in science too.
You see it in some aspects of science, but not universally for all of science. And we're going to all learn more from the American Academy's public perception study that was referred to earlier that'll come out in February.
I've seen some other statistics, but,
Yeah,
but nonetheless, it's very divided.
Yep,
And
I
I don't
agree
think
about
that I don't think the march made any attempt to try and heal that divide.
Correct. And GWIR also had a convening about this 2 GWIR meetings ago about examining the public mistrust of science, and there was a lot of really fascinating data. And by the way, the reports from GWIR meetings end up on PDFs on our website at the academies, so everybody can go. And there's some good. I'm looking at Susan. There's some good graphs that show these data about public perception of science in that report, right? Yeah. So you can go right now and download it and see some of the latest research.
By the way, there are ways that you can reach out to more traditional Republicans around science, and that's how important it is to national security,
Correct.
which is incredibly important. Everything from, you know, I mean, you know, anyone who thinks the next war is going to be missiles, you know, bioterrorism is, you know, right around the corner, and, you know, health security is absolutely critical. And I think we need to get beyond the things that convince some groups of people and start talking about more broadly.
Comment?
I really don't have much substantive to add. I agree with most everything that's been said.
Of course, I agree with everything everybody said.
Can I just
Yeah,
say
Mary?
one more thing? Because I don't agree with you, Anna Maria.
I know.
About the
That's okay.
apparent,
Good.
I know,
Get a little
right, about the
controversy going.
apparent divisiveness of the march. But I also want to point out that you're so right that there are important ways to talk about the value of science and of higher education to people of all political stripes. And I like to point out, and some people say, well, it's only true in the health sciences. I don't believe that at all, but if you look at the named buildings at the National Institutes of Health, They're about half Republicans and half Democrats. And the next two buildings are going to be named for Republicans, for Roy Blunt and Tom Cole. That's my opinion, that's my prediction. That isn't in the works or anything like that.
You heard it here.
But they have that kind of commitment, legacy commitment, and they're acting it out. They are acting on it. And that will, in fact, kind of even out the Democrats and Republicans. And there's many more buildings that could be named.
Yeah. And certainly when I was...
You about from women
yeah,
or underrepresented minorities?
groups,
or
well,
Coming,
dare
coming.
to dream. And certainly when I was...
Or you're in the middle here, so.
Thanks. Well, no, when I was at NASA, I was just going to say that we definitely observed this. It was not typically the issues that we would raise were not partisan. That has... I think we've started to see that drift worse than where it was even 5-7 years ago. But again, it was, you know, a lot of this politics is regional, about where there are large installations or big research universities or organizations that partake in this enterprise. And I do have hope based on the budget deliberations this year, which could have been a heck of a lot worse, and we're not done yet, to see that people on both sides of the aisle really stepped up to try their best to protect this enterprise. And so that does give me some hope.
I should say how I agree with everybody. It was politicized, but I think it's very hard. There were two things to say, I guess. The times were very politicized. I mean,
Correct.
It was almost hard to do anything without it somehow being polarizing in some communities. Second thing relates to the first. It was hard to disconnect it from the climate issue, which of course is even more strongly politicized. I worked with Al Gore in the White House and Bill Clinton, and people would say, well, that's where the politicization, and that's where the Democrats took climate change away from the Republicans. No. Anyway, wherever it started, it got deeply polarized, and I think that kind of washes over into science. Third thing I would say is I was very worried about these marches because they can get out of hand. But the good news was it didn't.
Not
I mean,
at all.
there were
close.
families there, the little kids. My favorite photograph from the Washington March was a little kid with a sign that says, you know, make Pluto great again. Well, you know.
I like the, what do we want? What do we want science? When do we want it?
Okay.
After peer review. That was my favorite one.
No offense to our astronomer friends who worked hard on this issue.
no, I'm
but
with you.
The
Pluto's
last
definitely
thing
a
I would
planet.
say, and it's not really, wouldn't suggest what to do differently, but I think it did project some positive aspects of science, community, family, you know, and it went well in that regard. But it didn't help, as far as I could tell, it didn't help show the important connections with industry and with technology, with engineering, I mean, which overlaps science more now probably than it has in many years. So it's not, I don't take that as a criticism of, I don't mean it as a criticism of the march, but there's a job to do, because these things they have to be connected. That's what our whole event is about. And we got to think of a way to tell that story better, and so I think it didn't quite do that. Can we take another? Yeah, we can continue this argument, or we can.
No, I don't see it, I mean, you know, as an argument.
No.
It's a good argument.
Good conversation.
Another question, please.
Hi, my name is Brian Bingham. I work with the U.S. Agency for International Development in our Center for Development Research. And my job there is really creating partnerships and managing partnerships between our agency and universities and industry when we have the chance. And as a former neuroscientist, postdoc, I really appreciate, with this sense of partnerships and with that science background, I really appreciate the human aspect, the conversations that we've had today. Because I think as we talk about partnerships, that is really the crux. Unfortunately, we see a lot of our trainees, particularly graduate students and postdocs, that are falling by the wayside with rates of emotional disorders 3 and 4 times that of the national average. And so there's this dark underbelly of science that we're not really talking about now. And I worry that by losing those trainees, we are losing people that we can have great partnerships with in the future. And so I'm curious about your thoughts of how we can change the scientific culture to retain those people and make this a better experience for our trainees and make them excited then to be our future partners.
Yeah.
Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so we're looking at how to redesign our graduate studies programs as we speak. Again, to more fully embrace this thing we're incredibly passionate about at the undergraduate level, where 100% of the students have these amazing experiences. Surprisingly, our graduate programs are pretty traditional, but we know that when learners have the opportunity to see how their work really makes a difference for people, that it ignites a passion that I think is not always there otherwise. I mean, look, I spent 4 years of my PhD in a tiny lab under the stairs in the basement of a building. Literally, the ceiling was sloped because it was underneath the stairs, and it was the size of a pretty lousy walk-in closet. And so I somehow came out of that really excited, but that's not true for everybody. Most normal humans, this doesn't work for, And so I think thinking about what kinds of experiences, in addition to and as part of their training, we can expose our graduate students to. I think it's good for them. I think it's good for the fact that, again, this recent study came out about how, more than 50% of the faculty come from the 15 institutions or something. So most of our PhD students are not going to end up as carbon copies of research professors. So how do we actually show them a world that's broader than the professorial track? And I think that will help us keep them engaged in doing important work. We need PhDs in all kinds of places in this country, not only in academia. So I think innovation in graduate education has got to be in our future.
I couldn't agree more about the need to, but I also think we need to look at the culture of the academy. I mean, add to what you're talking about, the sexual harassment, mostly of female graduate students. We're going to be hearing a lot more of the Me Too, because I could ask any woman here to raise her hands and they'd probably all say Me Too while they were graduate students. And I think that on the one hand, I love the fact that academia tolerates really quirky people. I mean, I think that that's wonderful. On the other hand, at times we tolerate things that we shouldn't. I've had an incredible difficult time, from the time I was dean up, when under having brought forward really awful behavior to try and get peers to agree that this person needs to be out is incredibly difficult. I think we have a culture where somehow, it's part of why you see fewer women in the tech field, where, it's like, we're going to stay up all night and we're going to stay up forever and we're going to work forever. And that's what makes a good science. And, God forbid you want to go home and take care of your kid, much less go take a hike or whatever. I mean, that's not, are you serious about your work? And, and I think we have a culture that, needs to be a little bit more opened up, that in fact, it's interesting because once you're in academia, we all acknowledge that, hey, you need a sabbatical every once in a while. But somehow for graduate students, if you leave the lab, you're not as serious. It's incredibly competitive, partly because they all think that they want academic jobs and that that's the only. And we talk about STEM. A biology degree and $5 will get you a latte. I mean, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but there's not, there are areas where there's not a lot of jobs in terms of, if you want to be a professor in an R01 university, and you see students and postdocs for 15 years. We may have a postdoc union. I'm staying out of the argument. That's up for them to decide, but I understand why they're thinking that way. And I think we really have to look at our culture and how human and humane we are. And I think that actually is one of the positives of having more women, more underrepresented minorities, people from, that are kind of changing the culture up a little bit. And what's interesting is, for example, we, as many others, you change the policy in terms of being able to take some time off the tenure track, thinking about women having children, and you have men doing that, sometimes to do startups. but it humanizes the culture for everybody. I think we do have to take a good hard look, not just a curriculum, but what are our expectations? If the idea is the only way you're going to succeed is to work 24/7, you're going to have people burnt out before they even start, and I see that. We have this faculty field tour where we take, junior faculty around, and, we do a fireside chat, and, and they ask me what they need to do for tenure. And, I always tell them, look, the first thing you have to remember is this is the first day of the rest of your life. If you start saying, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that until I get tenured, you think when you get tenured, all of a sudden you're going to change? Start doing what you want to do now. And if you don't get tenured, maybe it wasn't right for you. But I think we have some big culture change that we have to do.
I agree totally.
How you say that.
Yeah.
Rick?
You're totally right that the culture change is really at the heart of this, and a lot of a culture change is about what we believe and what we believe our purpose is in higher ed and what we believe the role of a successful faculty member is. And as long as we keep thinking of it as replicating ourselves, doing somebody who is a monastic individual contributor who dreams up great ideas that win the Nobel Prize someday, and that's all I do, and I count my success by how many papers and how many PhD students I've produced, we're going to be in trouble because this is not the life of the students. There is some serious work underway now to rethink what a PhD should be in the 21st century. For example, there's a really interesting program at Dartmouth where they have completely changed what the PhD looks like in engineering. I happen to know that because I'm in the engineering field. But it includes entrepreneurship as one of the requirements. It includes working in a multidisciplinary team with people outside of engineering. It includes problem finding, not just problem solving. It includes people at the center of things that you do. That's, I can guarantee you, not the way the faculty members who created that program were trained, because that wasn't the model when they grew up, but they're thinking forward. And this sort of reminds me of Mary Woolley's quote here a few minutes ago from, what was it, 300 BC?
307 BC.
Yeah, so change needs to happen structurally as well as culturally.
This need for change in the culture is difficult, has already been pointed out. Also needs to involve the federal research funding agencies in some way or other, because that peer review process reflects just what you're talking about.
Correct.
On the issue of the other issue of culture, I hesitate to mention it, but I'll mention it because it's public. Many of you may have read an article about alleged harassment in research going on in the Antarctic in, I think, 1999, roughly that time frame. I urge everybody to read it. I know absolutely zero about the case, so I wouldn't comment on that, but the narrative gets at some of the issues that Anna Marie is talking about. This serious issue we haven't really figured out how to deal with on our campuses.
Field-oriented sciences are especially vulnerable, I think. Yeah.
Whenever people are in a different, but I do think that we're making progress, but I think we have a long way to go.
The leadership of the institutions helps make that happen. You've done
Certainly,
a lot in your
spending a lot of time on
institution.
things like making sure policies around conduct are reasonable and so that we don't run into this issue of where something's obvious and you can't make progress. I think that is where leadership really has to come in and say, no, it's not okay to handle these things in the same old way we always have.
Please, next question.
Thank you. It's Wayne Johnson again. I'm going to aim this question at Rick Miller because I think he's an exemplar, but then he'll hear my question and he'll probably wonder why. But I started out my career hiring hundreds and thousands of engineers. That was one of the things I did. About 5 years into it in this operation, one of my bosses said, could you figure out why we get such lousy engineers here? We interview with 50 schools, thousands of interviews. We bring them in. Who we hire, they come in, they can't walk, talk, and chew gum at the same time, work in teams, write papers. What's wrong with this? Would you go figure it out? Well, I love those kind of challenges. Long story short, fast forward 25 years, I'm managing some university relations programs for big companies, and I decided I'd stop complaining and start contributing, and so I joined a bunch of activities. One was Engineer 2020 at the Academy. There was a new accreditation requirement called ABET EC 2000. I point this at Rick because Olin is an exemplar for where I thought it was going, but subsequently being on a board of one of the universities in Boston, talking to the provost, he said, you know, Wayne, nothing is changing. This outcomes-based assessment stuff, we're not implementing it. The reviewers don't know what they're talking about, and it's not going anywhere. And I've checked in more recently, and I would say, I'm generalizing, but this is a very important thing for where engineering education is going. Why is this taking so long? This was 10 years ago that we started this, and we know what the answers are, and I think Olin is a good example. Rick, what do you think? And others can please answer it well, but I think it's very important to understand that.
Well, Wayne, Olin is not the only school that's trying new things, too. I think you can tell from President Leshen's comments that WPI is doing many of the same things that Olin is doing and is having great results, too, and it's not just the two of us. I think the reason it takes so long for these changes to take hold is really quite simple. At least if you're simple-minded like me, you think of the world this way, and that's that you can only teach what you know. And the faculty that we have were trained up in a system which was different than what we need today. What I'm hearing from industry is that they need more than knowledge and skill. They need more than the ability to solve differential equations and to apply thermodynamics. They need attitudes, behaviors, and motivations and beliefs that make them useful in a group. So they need actually 5 mindsets, is what I'm hearing. One of them is a collaborative mindset, sort of thing that indicates people who naturally have an affinity to eat lunch with somebody else and to have a conversation with people outside your discipline and feel comfortable with that. They need interdisciplinary mindset so that you don't define yourself as this narrow specialist in a tiny little area and feel that you add value only when you have the absolute answer to everything that comes up, rather than you're just on a journey and you happen to have this, like what town you came from should be what degree you got. The third thing I'm hearing is they need an entrepreneurial mindset, not in the sense that everybody's going to go out and start a business, but that everybody thinks like an entrepreneur. They think that there is an opportunity to create some value with things that are new, but it takes resources that you don't have, and so how do you persuade others to join you in this enterprise? They need an ethical and an empathetic mindset, a real understanding of people. So many of the grand challenges that we have today in the 21st century are unintended consequences of the challenges that we solved in the 20th century because we had the wrong people in the room. We had a whole group of engineers sitting here fixing a transportation problem, and it created a change in the environment. So starting with the right multidisciplinary group could be useful, and caring about that is really important. And the last thing, particularly in America, is a global mindset. Understanding that the world doesn't start and stop with San Francisco and New York, that there is other people groups out there, and that the challenges we face today are existential threats on the planet. If you look at the population graph that shows human population over all time, it looks like a hockey stick. Until 1920, it was 1 billion, period, or below. And then it's 7 billion today. It's on the way to 9 billion. Population biologists have seen this graph before when it looks at things like the population of rabbits in the outback. 1 generation later, they're gone. If we're going to do something to prevent that, we're going to have to think differently, think globally. There's a role for American industry to play. There's a role for Chinese industry, but we need to coordinate. There needs to be a systems approach to this. These kinds of attitudes and behaviors are what I'm hearing as the responsibility for higher ed. I actually learned a great deal about this from my mentor, who passed away in July, so I'm pretty familiar with this. I went to the University of California at Davis as an undergrad, coming from the farm, and I probably shouldn't be here, but he helped me. He happened to be African American, and he was like one of the first African American faculty members at the University of California. So what he taught me, in a nutshell, is this: hopeful faculty members spread hope among their students, and cynical faculty members spread cynicism. And have you ever met a cynical entrepreneur? You haven't, because it's an oxymoron. And every time you walk in the classroom, when you pick up a piece of chalk, you're not just teaching calculus or engineering, you're shaping a mindset. And not because you're getting paid extra, or you have extra reading, or there's another test on this, it's the way you treat people. That's what we need to be doing differently in engineering education.
I think we ought to applaud.
Yes. I totally agree with everything you say. I'm just going to point to something a little bit differently, in that I think it's not just that people are trained folks according to how they were trained, but, you know, heck, I'm a psychologist, and I think we're all at some basic level rats, and we push, and we push the lever that brings the pellets.
Yep. Incentives work.
So, you know, people like me have to work to figure out how do we put the pellets in different places, and then people will change their behavior.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think that we've been doing all the things that you're talking about, because that's where the pellets come. You know, that's what makes you, you know, hey, you know, a rock star scientist. There's lots of publications, and, you know, maybe not being able to talk to other people. That doesn't matter. And, you know, and I do think that, you know, for example, we've got an initiative at our university called Population Health, and I won't go into a lot of details, but one of the things we did is we have put into some small seed grants. We will give you, to get the seed grant, you have to agree to bring on a social scientist, and we will pay for that social scientist to be part of this project. So you can look at the policy dimensions, or you can look at, you know, how will that translate into people's lives. I think engineering has been quicker at this than the traditional sciences. They count patents as one of the things, you know, and so I really do think we have to think about, well, you know, you're doing a beautiful job of capturing the mindset. I think to change it, it's not, people will change if we change the incentives.
Yeah.
So we got to figure out where to put the pellets.
I think that's on us as university leaders, but I also think there's a good role for government funding here as well. So we have a wonderful Iger grant, you know, PhD program, interdisciplinary,
It's a wonderful example,
right?
yep.
Where it's very interdisciplinary, and where entrepreneurship is folded in as well, like the Dartmouth program you mentioned. But that's like this special little thing that's off to the side. What if every NSF grant that funded a graduate student had to include some kind of a different sort of experience, or a different, you know, how can, you know, government positioning really drive the change in behavior that we want to see? I think there's probably more conversations we could be having. It's a broader impacts in a different way.
Believe me, if we changed, you know, what you needed to do to get the money,
you betcha,
people would do what they needed to do to get the money.
Yes, they would.
But Jeanette mentioned broader impact. Broader impact is my fault, so if anybody wants
yes, good for you, though.
wants to throw. No. And the reason was that we really needed to do something to read. The review criteria had gotten stale, and people didn't understand what they meant. And so there was a time to look at the NSF. And a lot of ideas on the table, and lots coming in from the community and the board and everything else. My view was that not to change the fundamental merit review criteria, namely that number one, the idea has to merit funding, because you got to cut off someplace. It's got to be, that's got to be the first place to start. But we had no mechanism in that review system to reward faculty members who did a great job of mentoring underrepresented communities, African Americans, women in science, and in other ways contribute to the overall scientific enterprise. There was just no mechanism there. So broader impacts, in my narrow view, was to recognize those contributions. And it got broadened and narrowed and broadened and narrowed, and it's changed over the years. I have no idea today whether it was a good idea or not a good idea, but that was the purpose, to at the faculty level, try to broaden people's involvement in other issues than narrowly their particular research project. But it's a balancing issue in peer review. And the other thing I thought was that young faculty will not have any idea what to do with this criteria, but they'll go down the hall, they'll find somebody on the campus, if not in the department, somewhere on the campus, who understands something about K-12 education or mentoring women and underrepresented minorities, or they'll learn from the process, and somehow the world will be a better place. And anyway, if you want to throw darts, this is the place to throw them.
Not at all.
So let's see. I think we're,
Right.
Any other comments? I think we go to the right side and then we'll be back.
Okay. Hi, I'm Beryl Benderly. I write for Science Careers on the science website. I write about early career scientists, mostly early career issues, postdocs, graduate students. I just wanted to call attention to two comments that were made in passing, like, gee, there's this odd echo. But anyway, two comments made in passing this morning, which I kept hoping would be followed up on, but they weren't. So I will repeat them. One was concerning PhDs, and I think it was PhDs in computer science, but in fact it's true in other fields as well, like a number of other fields, where the person's, and I can't remember who it was who said it, one person said the discussing problems, I think it was in the first panel, discussing problems, and it was said, problem is the PhDs are mostly men and mostly not American. And then someone else said, just in passing, about graduate students, the exploitation of graduate students. And so because of what I write about and the people I talk with a lot and hear from, it seems to me there's a message in that mostly not Americans, that a lot of Americans are voting with their feet. They have figured out that the PhD is a con game, a pyramid scheme. That's not my term, that's Paula Stefan and Susan Gerby's term. And part the problem is the severe overproduction of PhDs for the available jobs, and this current movement or interest in kind of figuring out how PhDs who spent all these years in their training can actually use that training for something useful. I just want to raise this issue. I don't exactly know what my question is, but I thought this issue deserved some attention at a meeting talking about industry and the universities.
I can provide just a little bit of context. This country does not attract a large fraction of our own students to continue in graduate work in engineering, at least, and I think even in science. So for example, last May, May and June, during the commencement season, hundreds of thousands of students in America walked across the stage and got a diploma, but fewer than 5% of them got a degree in any kind of engineering from any university in America. Yeah. And that compares with about 12% in Europe and maybe 30% in Asia. It's been a couple of years since I looked at the statistics.
Yeah, it's 1.9 million bachelors and 100,000 engineering. Yeah.
And but if I could add, in sort of the glory days of American university, of American engineering, like the space program and like that, you'd think of an engineer and he was an American white guy with a crew cut. So something is different about the incentives now. That American guys who, well, they don't have crew cuts anymore, but those people who, they're not seeking those jobs. Why not?
Hey, I would do anything to wear a crew cut today. I'm not so sure that even in the 70s and 80s that the graduate student population wasn't also dominated by students from other countries in engineering. The US is identified globally as being the center of really innovative and productive and useful ideas in engineering. So we attract sort of the best and brightest from around the world to enroll here in graduate education. So the competition is high. But the fact is, most American students, for whatever reason, don't choose to go on to graduate work in engineering. And about half of all the students who choose to major in engineering as a freshman in this country never complete the program in engineering. Many of them will graduate in another discipline, but they won't graduate in engineering. and only about 18% of them are women. And this is a very persistent problem. It's been at least 30 years. We've been talking about this. We haven't really found a way to break through. And I'm sure others on this panel know more about this than I do.
Well, not only engineering, but science as well, physical sciences. Postdocs are more than half not American. So I'm just wondering, something's wrong.
I guess, I think part of what's wrong is that we don't send the message to PhD students that there are other amazing things you can do with a PhD than be a faculty member. I would argue that we don't need fewer PhD students necessarily, that industry kind of loves PhD graduates, and certain PhD graduates love industry, but we don't, but again, our faculty don't necessarily, most of them, that's not true for all, but most don't have that experience to be able to offer that as a pathway. And we go to a ton of trouble for our undergraduates through things like career services and projects and things like that to show them the possibilities of what's out there. We don't go through that same effort with graduate students, and I think we need to. But coming back to the statistics for 1 second, the one I don't have in my head is about the master's level in a lot of these, and especially engineering, where it is getting to be sort of the expected degree almost. And I think there's probably a lot more we could be doing for undergraduate engineering majors to get them that master's pretty quickly as part of their undergraduate training. More places are doing that fifth-year master's. We have a big push right now to do what we call more in 4, where so many of these kids now come in with AP credit and IB credit out the yin-yang. And so they can actually finish a master's in 4 years. It's not for everybody, but for those who can, if we can kind of show that continued educational progress, I think it's also a positive thing to focus on, and it's a great way to increase, the credential per dollar, if you will, and deal with some of the cost of higher ed issues.
I think it's, that this is a ripe area for research, and that it probably is really worth looking at. And I wouldn't necessarily, put it in terms of, American, not, but just in general, what are the kinds of things that are not encouraging? What are the kinds of barriers, et cetera? I actually, and so what I'm going to tell you right now is speculation. One is that I do think that part of it has to do with some of the barriers we put in other areas towards particularly immigrants. In other words, that they're much less likely to, be accepted into the banking or politics or a whole range of other career options. I also think that when it was described, and I've done a little bit of research in this area, it's clear that particularly first-generation immigrants, it actually stops petering off by about third gen, and I'm a first generation, I'm actually an immigrant, is that, the work ethic and the drive is amazing. Part of it is you don't have a safety net. I went through undergraduate in 3 years because I didn't want to take out too many loans. I finished off my PhD despite some real difficulties in the family quickly. I was working 2 jobs in addition to my RA, and I got early tenure. It was like I did not have a safety net, and I was goddamn not going to fail. That was all there was to it. And if it meant that, I'm not sure it was healthy, let me be clear. But I think that and so that's part of where that dovetails with, that whole, is that really what we want people to have to go through? Is that really what we need to create, good PhDs? I think also some of what someone else was describing as, the compliance that we expect at times from graduate students in terms of you're going to do this work or that work. I do think we have to relook at the culture some, and I think that will be part of the answer, but at this point it's speculation. I don't think we have a good idea, but I am concerned about the overproduction. I think part of what happens is the tyranny of metrics, the tyranny of ratings, et cetera, is that, now everyone wants to be like a, no matter what your charter was, you want to be like a research university too, and you want to have graduate students because that's what's prestigious, and, just teaching, hey, that's not good enough. And so then you have, a third-tier program, and I don't mean that as an insult, but that the graduates of those programs are not going to get PhD jobs, but And part of it is, looking at other options. You do have other skills, but I think that there's a bunch of stuff in there that we need to unpack and understand better.
Next question, please.
I'm Jeffrey Fry. I was a faculty member at, I think, what people would call Tier 1 research universities in electrical engineering for 30 years. And then I became an attorney because I was frustrated with a lot of the issues with graduate education, science education, that the previous questioner alluded to, and particularly in terms of overproduction, in terms of the types of students that were applying, and so on. But I have a genuine question for the organizers of this, quote, national convocation. Where are the faculty members in this convocation? I've seen only administrators and people from anonymous initialed organizations.
I'm still a faculty member, by the way.
No, I was about to comment.
We don't count. No, we don't count.
These people, these administrators, presumably
Still
many
publishing.
of them work their way through the ranks, but they're now administrators, and their interests are disjoint, generally, with those of the faculty members. In fact, this particular administrator referred to her faculty members twice in supercilious terms, really quirky people, and sometimes their behavioral problems. And
I didn't say behavioral, I did say quirky, and
I think I have not heard.
That includes me.
Yes, I can see that. I mean, for example, you're exploiting the homeless people in Seattle, right? You're getting a
Wow.
out of them, and they're taking some of your real
So
estate.
let's have a question.
How do you really feel about
my
me?
question really is, how can you,
Let's
how
have a
can you
question,
treat
just
this
a question.
problem without including faculty members in your discussions? Otherwise, you're just going to dictate things which won't work.
Agreed. It's got to be a collaboration. And I think it's going to take a long time as a result. And that the students and the outcomes are worth it, so that it's something that we have to try.
This is my first National Academies kind of gig, but my understanding is that at most of the committees, et cetera, they're mostly faculty members. And so, maybe we've got an odd representation here, but I really do think of myself. I've been at the same university for 31 years. I came in as an assistant professor. I'm not an administrator out of central casting, and I still think of myself as a faculty member. First, my business cards say professor of psychology and then president.
But is it so evil to have administrators who want to collaborate? I mean, like this whole us versus them thing, I think is really counterproductive. Understood. And we need that diversity of thinking to do it well. I totally agree with that.
Don't completely agree. There's a reason, at least in our case, why I'm here as an administrator and most of our faculty are not. The implicit understanding of where your energy is most useful as a faculty member is with the students that you have and with the research contracts that you're working on campus. And the outward-facing issues, the problems with media, the problems with the government, the problems with other institutions is disproportionately expected to be carried by administrators. So I think a lot of our faculty members do care about what we're talking about here today, but they felt that this type of responsibility was more my job than it was theirs.
Question.
Yeah. Ramakrishna from the National Academy of Engineering. There's been a lot said on the kind of the impedance mismatch between what universities are trying to do and what industry wants as a product. But I would venture to say that there's another impedance mismatch from the students' perspective, from not only the high school students coming into the college, but also the ones in undergraduate programs, what they're expecting as an educational experience. And I could say that we are not doing as good a job as we would like to do in providing those experiences to them. For example, they're all highly want to change the world, make the world a better place, and these kinds of thinking is what they're coming in, and we're not providing, I think, experiences for them. So my question is, how do you think that this university, industry, government partnership can help in providing more opportunities for students to do these kinds of experiences?
Well, I do think, and I've said in my remarks previously, that we're missing, and this goes to the previous questioner's point also, we're missing some important voices. If we think that GWIR represents all views, I mean, it just doesn't. But that doesn't mean it doesn't serve a function and a purpose. But we don't do as good a job as we should in listening to students and their expectations and needs, demands even for change. I think there's more listening going on in that regard. And I certainly hear it when I'm out visiting our members in a number of different settings. When those are university settings, students are very clear in approaching me to keep pushing, to get the kind of attention to their perceived need to be credited for public outreach, to have somebody value that, not to have to do it in secret, to be learning about communication and the political structure and so forth that influences science, and to not just do it as an afterthought, but they don't perceive that their faculty and those above the faculty and administration put a value on that for students, much less, and also for faculty. So there's cultural changes needed. I think all of us have touched on that. And I think it's imperative for the Academy to recognize that, honor it, and be engaged in doing things about it. And the Academy is. And of course, we could always do more.
It's especially important in the first year or two, when we do tend to get into this, box checking of all the basics that you need before you can think about serious problems. That, we've demonstrated that that's really not the case, that these students, given the right support from faculty, can start addressing real problems, real challenges that will spark their imagination from the day they walk in the door, and figuring out how do we incorporate more and more of that into the early curriculum, I think is one concrete thing that a lot of places are trying to do and think about, and places like Olin and places like WPI are trying to help with that as well.
It's interesting, I spent a couple of days ago a fair deal of time with other university presidents that had medical schools and hospitals. And it's not entirely done, but there's a number of places that have totally revamped their curriculum, including ours. So it used to be that you spent 2 years basically doing lab work and taking courses, et cetera, before you even touched a patient. Now you are doing patient work your very first year. And they've been able, it took them about 3 years, but they totally revamped their curriculum. And so far, the news is very good in terms of the engagement of students, their enjoyment of what they're doing, rather than this you have to trudge your way through 2 years. I mean, we know that a lot of the engaged learning, hands-on learning, that not only can it be a great educational experience, but it tends to keep in non-traditional populations more, because I'll give you an example of myself. When I took my first semester of statistics in graduate school, it was all theoretical. It was with a professor. It was his, actually, I didn't know that, but the last quarter before he was retiring. And in fact, that was a good thing, because he never turned in grades. Because, or it took him about a quarter or so to turn in grades in another semester. Because if it had, Yale was too good to give A, B's, or C's, so it was, honors, high pass, pass, and I would have gotten a pass, and a pass was really a fail. And, I might have been put on probation, but by then, I'd taken my second semester of statistics, and it was a very different instructor who had us start with our data sets. And it was all about how do we use different statistics to look at our data sets in different ways. Not only did I get an honors in that class, but the basic paper that I turned in was my first single-authored publication in a good journal. I mean, it's like, if I know why I'm doing something, damn it, I will figure out how to do it. But the totally, hey, it doesn't do it for me. And I'm not saying that it's, bad thing or good thing. Some, I have students that can think very, but there are different learners that we leave behind when it's like the rewards are 5 years from now, you will,
I'd like to add just one thing to that. The turning point for us, and for me in particular, in thinking about what the experience is for students and how in engagement with industry matters is to imagine that engineering is a performing art. And so learning this is actually different than learning about something. You're learning to be somebody. So if you're learning to be a musician, you can't do that without playing the instrument in front of an audience. So we think a good education teaches you about stuff, and it gives you maybe the credentials to get a job, but a great education changes who you are. And the best way to do that is to think about playing the violin in a practice room with your teacher might show them that you know the notes. Playing the violin on the stage at Carnegie Hall, that changes who you are. And by having a paying client, having a company, having somebody who cares, a group of people who cares about the thing that you're doing while you're still a student is really transformative. And I'm sure you've all seen this in your institution as well.
I'll take it one step further. We not only do, we do pretend you have a violin.
Yeah.
So we got two more questions, one at each mic. So Mike, it's your mic.
Neil, I think it was comments and questions. I'm going to make two very, very brief comments. One having to do with engagement of the public and communication. Scientists not only need to learn how to communicate, they need to learn how to listen. Most scientists lecture. They're preachers. That's not enough. You need to listen to your people in your audience. Second comment I want to make, it's because I've been working on a book which will be coming out in the spring, and I learned something very interesting, that until the Second World War, the social sciences were treated just on the same par with the natural sciences. And it was the Second World War that changed that, for reasons that, when I go back and I look at the history of it, not completely clear, but up until that point, it was integral. We should get back to that.
Thank you.
Question. Hi, I'm Mary Uhas from Ohio State University. My day job is Associate Vice President in the Office of Research. I'm also Clinical Professor of Material Science and Engineering. So I've been doing engineering for a long time. And I appreciate Rick's comments that things haven't really changed. The numbers have been flat. So last week, I was in a discussion, kind of a hallway discussion with some colleagues in arts and humanities. We got into a discussion about how, and this went very, very quickly, how women can be socialized at a very young age that they don't do math, right? And so we all know about that, math and science. And I said, it's interesting. When I think back to my freshman, sophomore year as an undergrad, I remember there were semesters where I was taking chemistry, biology, physics, and calculus. And I needed one more class. So I needed that class where I knew that I could relax my brain and get an A. And so I would take things like, French, English, whatever. But then I thought, why isn't that flipped? Why don't German majors take linear algebra for kind of that fun course? But if really understood, linear algebra is a very interesting class. But we tell ourselves that that's not for me, that's too hard. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time. And what really got me started on it was the 2004 election, when a lot of people were being told junk science, and that was going into the voting booth. And so over the years, I've been thinking about why can't we teach engineering for the non-major? And I'm just going to speak through my lens, which is engineering. Getting the general public to think about, and I know that NSF funded, I don't know, a decade ago or so, the public perception of engineering and science, and there was a National Academy study. And what they found out was people who got their news from supermarket tabloids and people who got their news from New York Times, Science, whatever, had about the same perception of engineering. And so I just feel like there needs to be a call to action for us to think about getting students, the public, involved in casual conversations that go into the voting booth about all the stuff now that's been so politicized. When I think back to 2004, that we were so naive, we were babies then. compared to where we are now with all the stuff that we read. So I just feel like this is something that maybe needs to come back into the discussion, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Comments?
I want to push back a little bit on some of what you said. And, now girls, same level of AP physics, math, as boys do, all the way up through high school. So that, the issue that there's a difference through that far is not there. And in fact, if you look at, studies that are looking at the highly gifted, women scoring in the top 5% in math are more apt to be lawyers than they are to be engineers or scientists. I think that the issues are more than, there are some gender differences. The distributions are different. Women are more of a normal curve. Men are more, as some people say, more geniuses, more idiots. It's a more bimodal distribution in terms of, skills in these areas. So, I'm not saying that there aren't any differences, but, the truth is that I think it has more to do with exactly some of the social aspects that we were talking about these careers. And it starts really, we see it really beginning in college. And so that is part of why changing the culture, thinking about different ways of teaching. I think it comes down to even thinking about different ways of selling. We sell STEM as, you can get a STEM degree and you'll make lots of money.
Get a great job.
And, there's nothing wrong with making lots of money, but, because of the way, I'm not saying that this is, biological, because of the way that we're socialized, if you sell women, this is a way that you could make the world better. But that's not the way. In the life sciences where you see women, in medicine where you see women at the same rates as men, we sell it as a way of changing the world for the better, of helping people. That's not how we're selling the other sciences.
My point precisely. And the first question we ask a young woman when she says, I want to major in chemical engineering and work for a pharmaceutical company, the first question we say is, do you like math? Are you good at math? It's absolutely wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
And so we have to soften it up. And I don't mean that in the way it sounds, but we've got to soften that pitch.
We have to humanize it.
Humanize it is the right word, exactly. And I would argue that the National Academies has done a major service to higher ed through the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, that thinking about helping universities frame engineering in this through the lens of solving big problems that benefit lots of people is great. And we, at least in our Grand Challenge Scholars Program, which is just starting, we've said we're doing this in engineering, but we're doing it across the entire campus, which for us means, like science too, woo. But a little bit of humanities as well. But for lots of more comprehensive universities, I hope this takes hold of thinking about how you broaden participation in addressing grand challenges. That is a way that you get many more students exposed to the ideas of engineering and what engineering can do through the lens of, taking on a great challenge and using it to help people.
I have a couple of things to add. I completely agree with everything that both have said. I think in order to change the culture so that engineering is perceived differently particularly by women, I think we need a new definition of what an engineer is. So we've been working on that some and have concluded that, at least for us, an engineer is a person who envisions what has never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen. So it starts with vision. It doesn't start with mathematics. I mean, I'm here because I did well on my math test when I was in high school. And I didn't know what an engineer was, and neither did my math teacher, but apparently that's what I was supposed to do. And actually, I went through 4 years, and I still didn't know what an engineer was, but that's okay. When I eventually did an internship in engineering, I discovered I really did not want to do what an engineer was doing, but now I had a degree. I think having a different definition helps to attract a different group of people around that cause, around that vision. And Olin has had at least 50% women since the start. Of course, that was part of our vision to begin with. The other thing I want to say is, roughly a month ago, a psychologist at Stanford named Carol Dweck won the first Yidon Prize. And you've probably never heard of the Yidon Prize. It's from a fellow in China. It's almost $4 million for someone whose ideas have changed education. You should think of that as 4 times a Nobel Prize. What Carol has done is develop 25 years of research around identity and mindset. And her work is really fascinating. It turns out that what kids believe about themselves and what they believe about their source of intelligence has an enormous impact on their identity and their belief in the future and what they can do. Most of the research, by the way, that's in higher education in this area, I think it's going on at Indiana University, is funded by STEM education around women and minorities studying in the first couple of years. And those ideas of mindset have a big impact on their choice. A lot of women leave engineering disciplines at a higher rate than men do, and many of those who do have higher test scores than the men who stayed. It's not that they're flunking out. It's not that they're incapable. They're opting out because this does not appear to be relevant to them. There's a lot we could do.
So we're coming to the close here. I was asked to make a few comments at the end. I'll ask the panel to stay put here. Given the extraordinary presentations that we've had and the discussion, including outstanding questions from the audience, I have no wisdom to add at all. But I worked nearly 8 years in Washington, and not having anything substantive to say does not really prevent people from talking. So I would like to make 2 quick points. One is that the speakers have done an extraordinary job of keeping a positive tone on all the presentations in our discussion. And we're living through extraordinary times. I mean, it is not easy, I would say, for any of us in our conversations, whether public or private, to keep positive thoughts ahead of us, to be thinking forward about how to make progress. Certainly in my lifetime, there's never been a political situation like we have now. About that, I would say, we still have very good people in the Congress and both parties working very hard on our behalf, and they need to know that they're appreciated. So all the good visits that you make and any other way you can encourage those champions of science, engineering, technology, education, please, we should all continue to do that. It may be marginal value, it may be incremental progress, but we just have to keep up that kind of good work. Along with that is what you all know, they're just outstanding people in all these federal agencies doing their jobs, trying to do their jobs when there are real questions about, I think, the leadership at the top, but they're doing good jobs. They need to know their work is appreciated. And so every opportunity you have to interact with those folks in the federal agencies that you're connected with, I think that's a very important thing to do. And finally, I would say, before thanking everybody appropriately, I'm encouraged by discussions I had around the hall about conversations involving several of the NGOs, the academies, the American Academy, Mary Woolley's shop, thank you for all you continue to do, ASTRA, the various disciplinary societies of the biologists, the physicists, the chemists, the astronomers, the mathematicians, and so forth, starting to be more discussion about how a voice together, a unified message, some efforts working together can have so much more value than all that we do separately. We should continue, so I guess my view is we should all continue to do what we're doing. All those things are very important, but there are some common messages that could be delivered. There could be some consideration, I think, to defining for the larger public what is science now? What is engineering? Is that the same as technology? What do we mean we say science and technology? What do we mean we say science, engineering? What's STEM all about? We don't even use the same language. Well, I should just speak for myself. But there's a need for some serious attention to the message we're trying to deliver, and then the mechanism whereby we do that. I also think, and have written in the past about this, I'll start it this way. When I came to NSF 1993, I was visited by biologists and chemists and physicists, and they all told me how great biology, chemistry, and physics was. And I thanked them for coming, of course. But then I asked the biologist, well, what about the mathematics program? I asked the chemist, what about the physicists? Well, we don't know anything about that. Well, go back and find out. Because if you can bring me some kind of ammunition that I can use with the White House, with OMB, for God's sakes, I hope I'm not offending any OMB people, and appropriation committees, that would be extraordinary value. And from time to time, there is a coming together, and then things get tough, and then it's hard to be coming together when the budget gets cut year after year after year. I guess just a final word here for coming together. We can be much stronger together than we have been separately. There are some discussions, there are some efforts to move in that direction, and I really want to encourage all of those efforts. And I should have, of course, mentioned our colleagues in the AAU and APLU and other educational organizations need to be a part of that. Because right now, that many of the American people don't like us. They don't like the universities, they don't like government, they don't like the companies, they don't like big pharma, they don't like anything. So how to get to those folks, in addition to the many ways that have been discussed by our panelists all through the day and our individual speakers, I think the NGO community might be an opportunity to do something that we haven't ever done before. I don't think we can't do it with government, we can't do it with industry, we can't even do it with these individual partnerships between the universities and companies. All those things are very good. We're going to need some larger effort. We're going to need to come together to make that happen. Just from my perspective, it's been a great convocation. I want to congratulate the organizing committee. I want to thank the National Academies, all the speakers, all the panelists, all the members of the audience who contributed through their questions and just through their participation and discussion in the wings. I think it is a terrific way to keep the conversation going. That's what we really need to be doing. And as we find other efforts to do that, I know that you'll be hearing back from us. So any final message about logistics or anything else? We have a reception? Is that when the lobster comes out? Okay. Thank you, folks, and thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
This was fun.
Such a pleasure.